In the last lesson, we left off by completing our card. I hover over it, it flips over, and then when I mouse off, we can see the backside. Now, I want to add some cool box shadows, and we're going to apply that to these divs right here. So, I'm going to say right here, WebKit box shadow, and we'll say 0 on the X and Y offsets, but 10 pixels worth of blur, and then we'll make the color black temporarily. Now, what you're going to see is that's really intense, and how often are shadows actually black? Instead, let's use red, green, blue, alpha, RGBA. And if I set 0, 0, 0, that's essentially black, and then I can apply alpha, transparency, and now you'll see we get much more subtle of a look. Now I'm going to bring that even lower to 0.2. But now the next thing is, it's looking a little too blurry, and I really don't want shadows on every side. I only want it at the very bottom. So let's do this instead. I'll show you a neat trick of how you can only apply shadows to one side. Let's return that to 0.8 so we can see. And our goal is to get rid of shadows on the left, top, and right. Watch what happens now if I say we want it to be on the bottom. So we're going to apply a Y offset of 6 pixels. And now you can see, all right, now it's starting to be slanted to the bottom. Next, though, we can apply a spread. And normally this is a positive number. So if I set 5 pixels, you can see that's the spread, how much it spreads out. If I set it to 10, there you are. But watch what happens if I set it to 2 pixels. That's going to come in. And that's what we want in this case. We want to sort of shrink the shadow so that you can't see it. So if I set a spread of -8 pixels, you'll see that that pulls the shadow in. It's still there, but now you can't see it. But because we did apply a Y offset, we can see a little bit at the bottom, and that's perfect. So now, if I hover over these, we have just a little bit of shadow on each one, and that really does help. The next step is, I don't like the color of the numbers. So right here, why don't we change the color? Now, we could try to figure out a specific color to use, like so. But if you're using SAS, you can dynamically determine numbers. So if I wanted to use some functions that are built in, and we haven't taken a look at 1% of what SAS offers today, but this is one of the functions. And I can say, I want you to lighten black by 50%. And that way, you don't have to know the specific numbers. You can make it relative. So for example, if you had an anchor tag, and when you hover over the anchor tag, you want to make it darker, rather than going to Photoshop and figuring out that color, you could just say, instead of lighten, you could use darken blue by 20% or so. Now in our case, I'm going to keep it lighten black to 70%. Now the next step is, if this were an actual game, maybe where you hover over it and maybe you're trying to match, this could be an issue where what if you decide that number 8, whatever the image is represented down here, needs to be placed at the very top. So you could take that, move it all the way to the top, but then you have this problem here. If I reload, now your numbering is all messed up. And this is an issue when you're dealing with numbered type things. You would then have to reorder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 to make it work. This is especially true when dealing with things like slides or presentations. So there's also a way that we can use CSS counters. And this is not CSS3, but not many people know about it. So what I'll do right here is I'm going to remove the actual number from each one. And I'll pause and do this on my own. There we are, and now we have the cards. The next step is I'm going to apply these numbers with CSS alone. So you might be thinking, well, what if people don't have CSS turned on? And that's something you definitely need to consider. Right now, our markup has an empty div in it, so you might want to do it manually as we did before, set a default, or if you have the luxury, rely on CSS to do this. If it's not important, if it's only used for presentation, then you could use numbers if you wanted styled numbers in the back. For example, maybe you are numbering all of your comments. You have a cool number on the top right of each comment number 1, 2, 3. You could use CSS to do that. Next, I'm going to return to my CSS, and we're going to dynamically add the counter. So we start by saying list items, and we're going to give a counter increment, and here's where we can apply an ID essentially. We'll give this an ID of item. Next, we're going to add content to the front div. Now, unfortunately, not yet can we use the content property. So if I were to write div to the front, that's not going to work. It will work in the future, and I can't wait to see that, but for the time being, you actually have to apply it after. So with SAS, we can place it within here and say after. And now we'll say content high, And now you can see that has been added there. Cool. But of course, we don't want it to say hi. We want it to say counter. And then we're going to pass in the ID that we set, item. And now we're dynamically determining these. And this is really helpful because if you reorder this, maybe you have a drag and drop feature and you drag this one to the top, it will automatically update accordingly so that you don't have to rewrite all of these numbers. All right, that's going to do it for today. We did a lot. You learned about how to use transitions more effectively. You learned about neat ways to use the spread feature in box shadow. We went over transformations and backface visibility. As you can see with CSS3, really the sky's the limit. You can do some amazing things if you're a creative type of person. Okay, stay tuned for the next lesson.